Welcome to the global launch of the Pledge to End Diabetes, Stigma and Discrimination. Welcome to our VIPs and all guests here in Melbourne and those joining us from around the world via live stream. I'm Swan, I'm a physician and journalist here in Australia.
And hi everybody, my name is Renza Scibilia. I'm a diabetes advocate and activist. I've lived with type 1 diabetes for 25 years and we are so delighted to be here talking all about how we're going to end diabetes stigma.
We are indeed.
Yep.
I'd like to acknowledge country. We're and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people here today or watching us today, and to any First Nations people around the world watching us today, because as with many things, issues, diabetes, stigma and diabetes, the impact and burden of diabetes itself is incredibly important and one of the manifestations of the gap. And I just want to say something off-piste, if you like. So for those of you watching internationally, a few weeks ago we had a referendum in Australia to give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a voice to Parliament. In other words, contribute their thoughts and ideas about federal government policies. We lost that referendum, but I want to talk about the medical evidence behind it, and it's incredibly important to this discussion about stigma today. So just give me a moment on this. Wherever you look, there are gaps. So in Australia, there's a life expectancy gap between non-Indigenous Australian and First Nations peoples of 8 years. Outrageous and something that and needs to be closed. It's widening, not closing. There are gaps in other areas too. If you are to take the train from Flinders Street Station here in Melbourne out to the suburbs, life expectancy drops the further out into the suburbs you get. If you take it from Central Station in Sydney out to western suburbs, life expectancy drops. The city that I grew up in Glasgow, the life expectancy between the longest lived suburb and the shortest lived suburb was 20 years. By the way, in Australia, that number is 45 years between the longest lived postcode and the shortest lived postcode. So the question is, why does that occur? Professor Sir Michael Marmot, an expatriate Australian working in London, has spent his life looking at the gap and why it occurs, because it occurs everywhere you look. Why is there this gradient? So he studied the British civil service. So the people at the top of the British civil service have longer, healthier lives than the people at the bottom. The question is why. We like to think we all know the answers to why. Same as we all think we like to know the answers to Aboriginal communities and why there's a gap there. It's cholesterol, it's smoking, it's lifestyle, it's education. So, sure, some of those things make a difference. Education makes a lot of difference, by the way. But even when he factored in all those variables, there was still a gap. There was still a gradient. And what he factored in eventually was something psychologists call locus of control. So those of you here who are psychologists or have done psychology will now fail me in first-year psychology as I describe locus of control. But very simply, it's where does my life get controlled? The decisions I make about my life and work, are they here with me or are they over there? If they're over there, they can be for lots of different reasons. Lousy boss, lousy job, that's what Michael Marmot studied mostly, but then he moved to a much broader socioeconomic definition of it. It's deprivation, disadvantage can remove the locus of control. When he factored in locus of control, the health gradient almost disappeared. In other words, it was one of the key variables that determined how long people lived in what health and what degree of health. And you think, well, this is some pinko, Nimbin kind of thing here with this vague and abstract. But Professor Bruce McEwen, the late Professor Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, a major research university in the United States, looked at this. He was a neuroscientist. What happens when you lose locus of control? What happens when you lose locus of control is that your body goes on the alert. But on the alert in the kind of way that, similar mechanisms to going on the alert when you're confronted with extreme danger, but it's actually at a lower level, but chronic. So something that's only supposed to last for minutes, lasts for weeks, years, or lifetimes. And when it happens, the immune system goes on the alert. called the innate immune system, so you get increased inflammation in the body. That causes premature aging. Stress hormones like cholesterol go up, increasing your risk of diabetes. Diabetes, well, we're talking about diabetes, aren't we?
We're going to be talking about that, yeah.
And your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up. So you prematurely age. So in fact, there are physical correlates of loss of locus control. The voice was about locus of control and returning locus of control to Aboriginal communities. And when you move to diabetes stigma, there is nothing more potent or toxic in terms of removing the locus of control of people living with diabetes than the sense that they're discriminated against, they are not valued, or they are defined by their condition. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And so while it might seem soft to talk about removing stigma, you know, I'm being cynical. I always go for the most cynical bastard in the room. I'm looking for the most cynical bastard in the room. I can't find them. But you know what I'm saying? It's not soft. It's actually, you know, and it's not just about how I'm going to look after myself better when I don't feel that stigma. It's actually about what happens to your body when you lose that locus of control. I'm sorry I took so long over that, but it's current, it's important, and it's not trivial. Sorry, Renza.
That's fine. I think that's really important. I know that if we look at data in the T1D index, which has plotted rates of type 1 diabetes around the world, if we look in countries such as, for example, India, there's people living with type 1 diabetes in India have 39 fewer healthy life years than people in higher income countries. So I think that, you know, when we can compare exactly what's going on, we can see that stigma absolutely is very real in a country like India where stigma is prevalent, and we're going to hear from Jazz Sethi later on to share her experiences there. We can see why we need to be addressing it. And what better day to be doing that than today? Happy World Diabetes Day to everybody, and it is a happy day. It is something we should be celebrating, yes. So we celebrate it today because it is Sir Frederick Banting's birthday, and Frederick Banting, of course, discovered insulin with Charles Best in 1922. So happy birthday, and thank you for my life to Frederick Banting. I'm so excited that we are doing this today because, yes, it is World Diabetes Day, but any day is a good day to be talking about why we need to end diabetes stigma. I just want to quickly talk a little bit about the pledge. It's a community-led initiative, and we're going to talk about why that's so important. The pledge is part of the international consensus. If you haven't signed it yet, you just need to go to enddiabetesstigma.org and do it right now, but I'm pretty sure all of you already have. We're going to talk in a minute about the consensus statement and what it is. Today's event has been enabled by the Australian Centre for Behavioural Research in Diabetes, which is a partnership between Diabetes Victoria and Deakin University, plus support from DDoC and the Diatribe Foundation. And for full transparency and to declare everything, I am the Head of Global Advocacy for DDoC.
So let's welcome two members, in fact 3 members of the international expert panel who've led the consensus. Renza is one of them. Jane Spate is another, Professor Jane Spate, who's Foundation Director of the Australian Centre for Behavioural Research in Diabetes, Diabetes Victoria and Deakin University, a health psychologist who's presumably just failed me on my first year of psychology, and has specialised in diabetes the last 25 years. Please welcome Jane. And Matthew Garza, who's the Destigmatized Program Manager of the Diatribe Foundation from San Francisco. Welcome, Matthew. So what's the background to the international consensus, Renza?
Well, I think Jane can talk about the consensus itself, but I'm going to talk about where conversations about stigma sort of started and why it's so important that this is a community-led initiative, if you like. People with diabetes have been talking about diabetes stigma and how harmful it is for very many years. Sometimes we don't even necessarily use the word stigma. We just talk about how hard it is because of the judgment and the blame and the shame that often gets pointed at us living with diabetes. So I think the really important thing here is that this started in community, but of course, I guess where the power is when we bring all stakeholders together. So we bring in researchers, we bring in clinicians, we bring in diabetes organisations, we bring in community groups. Everybody has a place to play in ending diabetes stigma. Almost everybody probably has a role or has had a role in contributing to it as well. But perhaps that's a good question to start with, Jane. You know, what is the international consensus? How was it established? How did this all start? How did we get to tonight?
So about a year ago, we started talking about we've been having a lot of conversations about what's the next step in our research around diabetes stigma, what's really going to be making the difference to bringing an end to diabetes stigma. What research do we need to do next? What training do we need for health professionals? What interventions do we need around media and campaigns and all sorts of things? And the thing that really struck us was none of this was going to change by individuals or small groups doing a small thing in their own location against that backlash that we've got that is this huge thing called diabetes stigma. So we realized that what we actually need is the power of the community to bring something together around this and for everyone to become more aware of it, recognize it, you know, when they see it, they recognize it, and then they say it, they call it out.
And you've reviewed the evidence on this. I think that the review is out today.
Yes, yeah, we have a...
So there's an enormous amount of evidence behind this. It's not just an opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. So about a decade ago, we did a systematic review of diabetes stigma. We found that there was almost no research going on specifically focused on diabetes stigma at that time, and we started a program of work, and then others around the world were inspired by some of that and joined us. And our latest review that's published in the Lancet Diabetes today as part of the international consensus paper demonstrates that there's actually been a six-fold increase in research in the past decade in this space. And now there is a wealth of evidence that demonstrates the harm that diabetes stigma does to people, to individuals, to their self-care, to their health, their physical health, their mental health, their well-being, their social lives, their professional lives. It also does harm to the clinical care and the funding for clinical care. It does harm to research and the funding for research. So there's just a heap of harms that are being done by diabetes stigma, and we have evidence to back all of that up, and it's published today.
Yeah. And how amazing that it was published today. I think that that's just a huge achievement.
It's a little coincidence, Renza.
I know. So with the consensus is the pledge. Matthew, tell us about the pledge. What is it?
Of course. So the pledge is basically our way of bringing all of the research and the facts and the figures and all of the science and translating it into something that all of us can understand and commit to. So it's a way of taking all that research and bringing it right into the diabetes community, right into the global communities all over the world who are interested in this and also who play a role in this. So the pledge is 7 actionable commitments that all of us can make aimed at creating a world that is more respectful and more compassionate and more caring for people with diabetes. It's a way for us to hold each other accountable and to hold ourselves accountable to making sure that we are completely removing diabetes stigma from the equation. So that way we can focus on efforts to treat, to cure, to advance all of the science in diabetes care and make it so that diabetes is not something that defines any one person, but it's just a part of who they are.
Fantastic.
And how's it been received?
Pretty incredibly in my regard. So pretty much globally, the pledge took off. And you'll see tons of numbers and stats today about how many people have taken the pledge and how many organizations. It's thousands of individuals and hundreds of organizations. I think we're like right at the 100-country mark of all of the different groups and people who have taken it. And it's been really well received with open arms. And I think one of the most important things to kind of remember, though, and it's something that Renza brought up, is this is something that people with diabetes have been talking about for decades, well before any of us were researching it and well before we had these coordinated efforts. So I think it's really a great thing that people with diabetes are finally having their voices heard. The rest of us are catching up to what's already being said. And now it's kind of on all of us to take the pledge, take the international consensus, and run with it, to integrate it into the work that we're doing, into the research that we're conducting, and into the advocacy efforts that all of us are contributing to as well.
I mean, it sounds, just for the last question, it sounds like an obvious question. The answer might be obvious, but maybe it's not that obvious to you both. How will you know it's worked? And don't just say there'll be no more stigma. because how will you know?
I can take a first stab, which is, one, I do believe that eventually we can have a world that is free from stigma, not just for diabetes, but for all health conditions. Nobody should be blamed for having something that's just a part of them, and something that is not always in our direct control. But I think that one of the ways that we're going to see this really starting to take off is whenever it goes beyond just signing a pledge. Whenever we see diabetes organizations and health organizations and media organizations integrating our pledge and our work into the work that they're doing, into their strategic plans, into their 10-year plan, making sure that they are no longer actively contributing to the diabetes stigma that so many people face.
Jane?
I'm not sure I have a lot to add to that.
You just want more grants for evaluation, that's what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course we need to understand exactly what's going on. We don't have national data, we don't have international data on an ongoing basis to monitor this, and I think that would be fantastic, but we'll need some funding.
Fantastic. Please thank Jane and Matthew. Wonderful. You don't need another reason to take the pledge, but if you haven't, do it. And tell your friends and family as well. We're going to play a little video for you now.
I'm the president of the ESD, the European Association for the Study of Diabetes. And we are proud to have signed the pledge to end the diabetes stigma. It is time to do this because there's still a lot of stigma around diabetes, type 1 diabetes, but in particular type 2 diabetes, where people are being blamed for having their disease. And it is time to end this.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Garza, and I'm the Destigmatized Senior Program Manager at the Diatribe Foundation, based in the United States. Nobody should ever experience shame, blame, or judgment for simply trying to live well with a serious and complex condition. And so I hope that people everywhere will join us today and in the future to make this hope for a world without diabetes stigma a reality.
To me, a world without diabetes stigma means that people put aside what they think they know about diabetes and instead assume that everyone living with diabetes is doing the very best they can with what they have.
And seeing so many individuals and communities come together to take this pledge means that we're actively prioritizing the overall well-being of those affected by diabetes. When we collectively reject diabetes stigma, we not only lay the foundation for improved mental health, self-care, and self-esteem among those living with diabetes, but we also create a pathway towards a more inclusive and compassionate society.
I've taken the pledge as a member of the End Diabetes Stigma International Consensus Panel. I've taken the pledge as a researcher who works in psychosocial aspects of diabetes, including the impacts of diabetes stigma. I've taken the pledge as a family member and friend to many people with diabetes. And I've taken the pledge as a woman who experienced gestational diabetes in pregnancy and, despite my work, experienced embarrassment, experienced self-blame, experienced negative judgments and assumptions. I've taken the pledge, like thousands of others who've come together to say enough is enough. And I thank you for taking the pledge.
Thank you to all those people who participated in that video. I'd like to introduce you to some young adults from here in Melbourne with type 1 diabetes, who are also members of the Future Leaders group, looking to actually change the situation for everybody with diabetes, and particularly young people. Daniel McCallum, please join us, Daniel, as I introduce you. Daniel McCallum is part of this group. He is studying for an automotive apprenticeship. When Renza asked him what his favorite car was, he said, too many to answer. Darcy Elgas is studying to be a youth worker and is also a devout Catholic. Liana Ang is doing her master's in biomedicine at Monash University. And Tara Montazeri is hoping to become a human rights lawyer, was born in Iran, and has personal experience of oppression, which she might tell us more about it. So this is no mean group of young adults. With whether or not they've got type 1 diabetes is almost irrelevant. Please welcome them.
Thank you seat. I'm going to sit down and we're going to have a chat, and it's all going to be lots of fun. So let's start by, it's going to roll off. Let me start with you, Darcy. Talk to me about, if you were to describe what diabetes stigma is to somebody, what would you say?
Pretty much an isolation of any kind just because you're diabetic.
Yeah, okay.
To take that part of your identity and kind of remove you from something else because of it.
Yeah. I'm going to come back in a minute and ask you about anyone who sort of, I guess, has made you feel stigmatised. So we'll think about that in a sec. Daniel, what about for you? What is stigma in your mind? What do you think of when you think of diabetes stigma?
I see it as just being treated differently and being made to feel different because you're a diabetic.
Yep, okay, absolutely. Yeah, and Liana, what about for you?
I would like to add that stigma to me just means a lot of assumptions, a lot of things that people think it's something, they think it's right, and more often than not, assumptions can hurt, but questions don't. So then, instead of assuming, we would just rather you ask us questions. So then we're more than happy to answer.
Yeah. And Tara, I'm going to ask you, but also Gordon mentioned that you, when we were speaking before, you were talking about experiences of oppression. I'm interested, where does diabetes stigma fit in that? Was that part of when you were feeling that way? Would you be happy to share some of your experiences?
Yes. Well, being a woman in, Iran and also having diabetes, I think like both of them has been like contributing to that stigma, and I feel like, especially being a woman, and in Iran, whereas like there was like no like proper like education around like diabetes, especially type 1, and I feel like that has like contributed to me having that stigma. Yep. And it's just mostly it is in a way that people like view me in a different way, like that I can't take care of myself.
Yeah, yeah. Daniel, you're doing an apprenticeship. Talk to me about, were there any extra hoops or anything that you felt that, you were made to jump through because of people's, perhaps their understandings about diabetes and what they, their misconceptions? Was there anything that made it harder for you, and what did you have to do to deal with that?
Well, when I got my job interview, it was all going well, and then I was offered the job, and then after I was offered the job, I told my boss that I'm a diabetic, and he took it really well. He just asked a few questions, which is reasonable, and then I got an email later on saying I need to have a physical exam to make sure I'm fit for the job, which I thought that could be a normal thing, but then later on, talking to the other apprentice who was hired only 2 months before me, he didn't have to do that, and he wasn't a diabetic. So, that's just something that I think I had to do because, maybe he thought that I couldn't do the job.
Yeah, yeah. Did you have that conversation? That's a really tough conversation to have, right? Did you speak with your boss about it, or?
No.
Maybe once you know him a bit better, you can ask about that.
Yeah, maybe.
Darcy, let's ask a tricky question. Where's stigma come from? Talk about some experiences and where it's come from. And this is a safe space, so knock yourself out.
Yeah, well, stigma often comes from a general misunderstanding of the condition. Instead of seeing people, you see a condition, especially in this context. I've had some experiences of stigma from within the medical industry itself.
Okay.
You would think those people would have the understanding, but even some of them are kind of off about it. I wasn't allowed to get behind the wheel of a car until after my 20th birthday because I had this medical team who were all like, oh, he's diabetic, he can't drive a car, he'll have an accident. So it took 4 years of my life to get this one piece of paper, and then I go to this one endocrinologist appointment and they're all like, oh yeah, you can have it, no worries.
So talk to me about that. Was there a concern that your diabetes was going to make you unsafe behind the wheel? What was the reason for delaying your license?
It wasn't always entirely made clear. I would just kind of go to these appointments, they would look over the data and be like, oh yeah, he's still diabetic, so we'll give it more time. But yeah, going back to school, when everyone else is getting their licenses and being able to drive really contributed to that stigma. Because then they were like, oh, okay, well, because you're diabetic, you can't drive, and therefore diabetics can't drive.
Right, I'm so sorry. I've swallowed half a plane tree or something outside and it's just gotten lodged in my throat. But then you did speak with an endocrinologist who was...
I had one appointment and they signed it off.
Did you ask why she was signing it off when others hadn't?
I probably should have. I think at that point I was just excited to have it.
Yeah.
I was in a bit of a hurry.
And you just drove off. Okay, excellent. All right, and Liana, let's talk a little bit about where you've experienced stigma. Have you experienced any from family or from friends, or has it been more from strangers?
I've had a few personal experiences actually with friends because when I was diagnosed, I was in the peak of secondary school. And then I naturally tend to kind of shun away from them because I was afraid of like hypoglycemia, and we would be out running around in the park, and then I would feel a little low coming along, and then I'd have to like excuse myself a little bit, and they would just be like, oh, like, look at you being weak, you can't even run like 5 kilometers, you know, and stuff like that. And I'd be really very embarrassed to tell them like what actually happening to me, so I just kind of went along with it. Yeah. So then, obviously it didn't feel very nice, but I'm glad that they know about it now that awareness is being spread around.
Yeah. Now we're seeing some words flashing up on the screen behind us and here. Language is really, really important, and we know that language contributes to the way that we think about diabetes, how we feel about it, how others perceive diabetes as well. Are there any particular words that make you cringe or that make you feel that make you feel stigmatized or make you feel that somebody perhaps might be discriminating against you? Yeah,
EpiPen.
Which one?
EpiPen. This is not that.
Oh.
This is an insulin pen.
People think it's an EpiPen.
They sure do. I get it all the time. Is that an EpiPen? Are you allergic to this or that? No, it's just insulin.
When I first started wearing a pump and I would wear it clipped to my belt, people would say, is it a pager? Which was 22 years ago, so kind of okay, but until, like, when people still ask me, I'm like, no, because it's not 1985. Of course it's not a pager. Any other words?
This isn't really a word in
That's
particular,
okay.
but being referred to as like a diabetic, when someone's trying to describe you as a person, and they're referring to, like, say there's 2 people with the same name and they refer to you as, oh, that's the diabetic one. That's a bit rough, I reckon.
Yeah, I really don't like just breaking this down to the word diabetic when we're talking language, but let's do that now. Are you comfortable referring to yourself as diabetic, or do you prefer to say person with diabetes?
I'm a person with diabetes.
Yep.
I am a diabetic, but you know, that's not how you describe me.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. It's how others perceive you, and then they might be starting to think that's what defines you. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't bring it up in general conversation. I just kind of get out my insulin pen and inject, and if anyone asks questions, I'll answer them.
Right. Okay, any words that are a bit triggering sometimes? Yeah.
Well, for me, it's not a word, it's a sentence.
Go.
Wait, was it because of too much sugar?
Was it because of too much sugar?
Yeah.
How do you answer?
I just gotta say it was genetics, because it was genetics. Like, yeah.
Yeah, that's
that's like the fact. It was genetics.
And what about, Liana, do you have anything that makes you just cringe?
I was gonna say the word disease or illness. Not very nice.
So what do you use?
So I just tell people straight out that I do have type 1 diabetes.
Yeah.
It's a condition. It's not exactly an illness, and it's not contagious. Even if we share food, you're fine, darling. You're fine.
Although maybe you don't want to share your food. So in those instances, maybe it is. No, I think that, words actually do have real power. We know that. We launched a language position paper over 10 years ago now, so we know that words absolutely do matter. And I think that in some ways, the language work that we did was sort of a bit the precursor to where we are now with stigma, but we know that it certainly is all connected. Let's talk about some ideas of hope, I guess. What is it that you would really hope that people, if they're learning about the pledge, they've taken the pledge, how is it that you hope that people start to see diabetes? How do we fix the image problem? You can go first, Darcy. Just because you're sitting right next to me, don't do that again. Okay.
Oh, is it too late to move? Look, it's a really good question, because I'm not sure if at the moment there is a clear-cut answer to it. I think we've all taken the pledge. That's a great start. One step at a time. Look, as we're kind of doing here, we can change up some of these words and remove them from the overall stigma problem. We can educate ourselves and everyone else just a little bit better.
Yeah.
You know, and just be good representation for diabetics.
Yeah. Do you think that this is opening up the conversation? Is this a good way to start it? Tara, what do you think about that? Is this a good way for us to be addressing this, is to be having these sorts of events and then for everybody to be going home and talking about it at home and at school and at work?
Yeah, I feel like the most important thing for people is to get educated. Like, I feel like education is what makes you, like, be aware of, like, the way, like, diabetics are, I guess, yeah.
Now, talk to me quickly about diabetes in social media. Do you find that that is a source of stigma? You know, the diabetes jokes or the diabetes memes or, I don't know, the comedians coming out with Liana, you look like you're ready to jump on this. Tell us what you think about that.
Yeah, contrary to a lot of popular belief, people feel like social media can be very negative and very harmful, but I actually think it can be really positive and beautiful as well. So I'm not sure. TikTok is up and coming these days, and there's a lot of people doing videos on like a day in my life or a normal day as a type 1 diabetic, and you just see them getting ready, going to school, going to work, and I think it's very beautiful seeing how these people are exactly normal people like everyone else. We're not different than you guys, so then don't treat us differently, you know, treat us like anyone else, yeah.
Yeah, so it kind of normalises what a day, or what diabetes is like. Yeah,
it does,
Darcy,
yeah.
what do you think?
Yeah, I think on social media or otherwise, it's really important to have a sense of humour about it, to bring some levity, because, you know, I think that ultimately tells people it's not that serious of a condition, it's not a death sentence. We can joke about it.
We can joke about it. What about when others joke about it?
Well,
How
when
does that make you feel?
At your expense, like specifically to make you feel bad.
Yeah.
It's really bad, you know, it makes everyone feel awful. But, you know, if you have that kind of relationship with them.
Absolutely, yeah. Any other thoughts on social media? Yeah.
Jumping on what Darcy was saying, I think, like, making you feel bad about yourself is, like, one thing as well, because, like, you see, like a funny joke about, like, diabetics, and then you're diabetic, and then you're like, oh, like, this is not nice. Like, I feel bad. Like, what do I have diabetes? Like, everyone is gonna, like, everyone who's, like, in the comment sections under likes, like, viewing this video, they're like, oh, like, that's how diabetics are. But, like, it's not.
Yeah. One of the points on the pledge is to call out, you know, to avoid and to call out this sort of stuff. So how comfortable are you calling out when you're hearing,
There's a difference between, like, because I don't know about you guys, but everyone kind of makes jokes, not jokes, references, I don't know, but little statements, but it can go too far. So I think the little, you know, statements are fine, but then when you're starting to make, like, you know, pretty offensive jokes, it can, you know, be a bit offensive.
Yeah, absolutely. These conversations started in community, they're continuing in the community. Thank you so, so much for being here tonight, for sharing your experiences. I feel like the Future Leaders program at Diabetes Vic is bringing together such remarkable, remarkable young people living with diabetes. We need advocates everywhere, so thank you for doing that. Thanks for lending your voice. Yeah, you want to finish?
Yeah,
you can say the last word.
Can I finish with a really cheesy platitude? There is nothing that diabetics cannot do.
All right, that's a good way to end. Thank you so much. That's amazing.
Thanks, Daniel, Darcy, Liana, and Tara. And now let's hear more about the use of language in stigma.
The Non-Communicable Diseases Alliance of Kenya took the pledge to end stigma to diabetes. We believe that everyone living with diabetes should be treated like anyone else, given the same opportunities to grow and to achieve their dreams and their aspirations. And this is why we took the pledge to end stigma and discrimination against those living with diabetes.
Northern Frontier Medical Association, taking the pledge means committing to an inclusive and supportive world to individuals living with the diabetes. We, as NOFMA, commit ourselves to fostering an inclusive environment and also promoting education and awareness on diabetes. We also advocate for accessible healthcare for all. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nina Touche and I'm Chief Editor of Glucose Toujours. We signed the pledge to end diabetes stigma because the press and the public space still stigmatize diabetes today. We signed the pledge and we invite our colleague journalists and news website to do it as well.
Hello, I am Eritrea Musa, the social media manager here at the Diatribe Foundation and co-host and producer of Diabetics Doing Things. I have lived with type 1 diabetes for 22 years now. I was diagnosed in 2002. And I'm here to help end diabetes stigma.
Hi, I'm Andy Bremed. I am Head of Engaging Communities and Volunteering, and I am one of the co-leads on our Tackling Stigma Target programme.
And I'm Colette Marshall, and I'm Chief Exec.
Our new target programme is Tackling Stigma, and this is a moment where we can all look across everything that we do and use our voice and our platform to fight the stigmatising views that people with diabetes experience every day. This is a core part of our strategy, as we know that stigma prevents some people from getting the healthcare they need and has a negative impact on people's sense of self-worth. Without addressing the root causes of these things, we won't be able to address the gap in care, be able to support people who are newly diagnosed, or even ensure there's equal access to diabetes technology, support, appointments, and everything else that people with diabetes need, regardless of their background.
I work as a credentialed diabetes educator with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I have no statistics or peer-reviewed evidence to quote about the impact stigma has on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living with diabetes. But from my anecdotal observations, from my daily interactions as a credentialed diabetes educator, I witness that stigma is the single largest barrier for people who need to screen for diabetes or manage their diabetes. It's up to us to collectively change this narrative to end diabetes stigma.
Hi, I'm Liz Kathko, and I have been living with type 2 diabetes for over 8 years now. I joined this pledge and made my commitment to ending diabetes stigma because I know there's a lot of people out there that don't have the resources, that don't have the voice to advocate for themselves, and it could, for a lot of people, be life or death, whether or not they get the care.
Hi, I'm Aska, and in my experience as a researcher, I have seen a real impact that stigma and discrimination has had on people with diabetes. I have taken this pledge to build a world where people with diabetes can live without these issues.
Fantastic. Chris Lee, come on up, please. Okay, let me welcome to the stage Chris Lee. Chris and I worked together at Diabetes Australia a number of years ago, and I'm so pleased that you're here to speak about your experiences of diabetes stigma. Chris has lived with type 2 diabetes since 2014. Yeah, okay. He's from the Larrakia people in Darwin in the Northern Territory, and he has 30 years experience in effective engagement and consultation with First Nations community. You want to engage with First Nations community? This is the bloke to do it. Your wealth of knowledge and generosity of sharing that tonight, we're so, so grateful. Chris is also on the expert committee of the International Consensus Statement.
Thank you.
Come over here. Let's stand more in the middle. Okay. There we go. Good.
Yeah, so we can both have a go at you.
Yeah. No worries. Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
So to what extent, I mean, we heard from Tara earlier that in a sense it's stigma on stigma. I mean, just talk us through the impact, because in terms of stigma on top of what Aboriginal communities are already living through.
So can you hear me? Yep.
Yeah.
So for most First Nations people, their stigma comes from themselves. They stigmatise themselves about the condition that they have. There's not much outside educational information, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, where Aboriginal First Nations youths and general community members who have diabetes or who are diagnosed with diabetes start to listen to the whispers that go around in the community. There's not much, and in many First Nations communities who are language speakers, who English is their third or fourth language, so there's not much resources around. There are some, and Menzies and Samri and others are doing some fantastic things. However, it's the Chinese whispers within the community. It's an old person's disease. It's a bad diet. You're not exercising enough. And so Aboriginal people, and I know I did it myself when I got diagnosed in 2014.
So you beat yourself up?
Oh, huge. And we talked about social media. That is a scary place if you're trying to find out what you have, right? And you've got all the different sides of medication and other things. So I actually spiralled in about 2021. COVID was around, it was killing people, and it was, you know, Aboriginal people of a certain age, people with certain conditions were most at risk. And I fell into many of those categories, and I beat myself up. I, in my own mind, I was saying, well, this is something that is, it could be potentially very fatal to me because of, and was it because of my upbringing, low socioeconomic upbringing? I was 7 brothers and 6 sisters. We're Asian and Aboriginal, so we have those, you know, predisposed. So there were all these things that coming at you at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And
did you feel unsupported by your own community because of the stigma that ran in that?
My own community didn't know. My own community were not really that aware, and I remember, because I worked in prisons for nearly 20 years, complete denial, just absolute denial. You know, because I would say to the boys, have you done your bloods today? Have you done your finger pricks? Nope, it's always too high. What? So there's a huge level of denial, and diabetes stigma is huge on the radar for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for a number of reasons. And you mix that in with, and thank you very much for your comments about the voice. There were a number of factors that compound with intergenerational trauma and a few other things. However, we stigmatise ourselves.
Well, it's fine to say that, but it's almost stigmatizing saying that, so if you don't mind me saying so. I mean, I think that we've got to find a solution, and one of the things about the international consensus is that it's been community-led. And one of the things that Aboriginal communities are resolute on, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, is about control, community control. Just take us the path through that community control theme and reducing stigma in Aboriginal communities. Or is it much bigger than that?
Well, it is, but it's a journey that I've been on since just after I got diagnosed, and then I became quite vocal in the Queensland Aboriginal community around what type 2 diabetes was, and I was still fairly ignorant myself, but I at least had done a little bit of research. Education is key, and it was mentioned before that we're genetically predisposed to getting diabetes and other metabolic conditions, and it's regardless of almost what you do, genetically you're gonna cop it. So when I got diagnosed, and I was saying, how is this? I'm a prison officer, I can lift heavy things.
It's almost part of your Aboriginality.
100%. They said, no, you probably got it in utero. And I was,
what?
Google. Yeah, so my mother, having had 11 children, probably had gestational diabetes. And the first case of, I'll just quickly digress, first case of diabetes in an Aboriginal person was recorded case, was in 1924, so 100-year anniversary next year. However, in that time, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia now lead the world in gestational diabetes, type 2 diabetes in pregnancy, and youth onset, so children as young as 6.
So not a race we want to win?
No, but we're out there.
So look, just give us a sense then, I mean, it's fine taking the pledge and saying what we're not going to do. How much of what happens in the non-Aboriginal world has an impact on Aboriginal communities? In other words, or is it really got to be focused on communities themselves?
There has to be Aboriginal co-design in any of the programs that are designed for First Nations communities. It was around that notion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people having a say in the design of any programs because they live it, it's their lived experience, they understand what works best. You know, that Menzies did a fantastic program with youth pre-diabetes and youth onset diabetes, and just the absolute shame that these young people felt. So they wouldn't talk to their closest friends, they wouldn't talk to their family, but there is nowhere for them to go to get information about it. When I got diagnosed, I was handed a big bundle of information. I think there was a portion plate. I think I've still got that. Never used it. And there's also a cookbook, but that was the extent of information for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with diabetes. That's why I went out and said, no, there's got to be more. I need to know what this is so I can be around for my children.
So Chris, when you started speaking about it, how much was that important for you to reshape diabetes in your own mind and to help work through that internalised stigma, which is very real? So how much did it help you? But then what did it do in your community when you were speaking about, when people heard you speaking about it, and was it something that people responded to?
Yes, it was huge. It was my journey of discovery that was full of these little dead ends and misinformation, but slowly wading through the material and talking to Aboriginal people who had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and type 2 is the prevalent one in Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Talking to them who have had it longer than what I had, they would bring up their tips and tricks, and you start to work out, oh, okay, so processed carbohydrates is not good for me, despite the fact I was brought up on them being, you know.
And the shop is full of them.
And the further you get off the bitumen into remote communities, it's the cheaper they are.
The shop becomes an issue, yeah.
100%. So, and then I started translating my story of diabetes and the story of diabetes into a language, a language that my peers would understand. And we used humour, there's a little bit of swearing in there.
But no portion plate.
No portion plate. No portion plate.
Chris, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and talking to us today. So Renza's now going to take us around the world in 18 minutes. Diabetes stigma, as you've heard again and again on the videos and in discussion, is a global issue. The pledge has been taken, as Matthew's indicated, more than 100 countries now around the world. And we're going to talk now live to some of those people around the world.
I am going to. They're going to appear by magic in a minute. Otherwise, I'm going to have to start telling jokes, and they might be diabetes jokes. They will not be. I'm really excited about this session because stigma is very real for a lot of people. I can see them there. Oh, there they are. For a lot of people, and today I'm joined by 4 of these people. I am so fortunate to call each of these people my friends. They are part of the DDoC community, the global community. They are all doing incredible things in their local communities to raise awareness of diabetes and to talk about diabetes stigma. Please join me in welcoming. We've got Anita, we've got Chelsea, we've got Helga, and we've got Jazz. Thank you so much, guys. Mwah. All right, I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourselves because you can do that way better than I can. Anita, sorry, you're first, yes. So you can start. Hello.
Hi. I'm Anita. I'm from Indonesia. I have type 1 since a kid, since 13. I grew up with diabetes. And as a girl coming from a low-income country, I experienced stigma as a girl. I'm invisible. But when I developed diabetes, I become visible as a burden in the society. And growing up, it's really difficult breaking the stigma. And then growing up as a woman with diabetes, it's very challenging because people easily blame your diabetes. When I'm experiencing difficulty in pregnancy, they blame my diabetes. When I had miscarriages, they blame my diabetes. I was really lost because I don't know where to go.
Yeah.
Because people easily blame about my diabetes.
Thanks,
So
Anita.
that's why I'm, yeah.
Thank you. Chelsea Rice, oh my goodness, Chelsea, it's 1 a.m. where you are. Thank you so much. Where are you?
What, like right here where I am now?
Yeah.
Well, I'm in the kitchen actually, so just staying away from my snoring dogs.
Thank you so much for joining us, Chelsea. Chelsea is here from the States. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am Chelsea Rice. I'm from the United States. I live currently in Florida. I have been living with diabetes a little over 30 years now. I was diagnosed back in the late 80s as a type 1. Currently using all types of diabetes technology for a man my age. But it's been a challenge. And one of the things that I'm working on now is tackling diabetes stigma in the workplace.
Fantastic, thanks. So Chelsea recently presented at a diabetes conference in Europe about his experiences with stigma, and he was joined on stage by Helga, who's joining us. Hi, Helga. How are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Everybody. Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Helga. I live in Cape Town, South Africa. It's over 30 degrees today, so sweltering. I've been living with type 2 diabetes for about 15 years now, and I was first diagnosed with gestational diabetes way back in 2006. And what had happened then is after the birth of my son, I was then diagnosed 5 years later with type 2 diabetes, non-insulin taking. And so, you know, it's taken me quite a while because part of my story is that because of stigma, because of discrimination, I chose not to speak about it. I didn't speak about it during my pregnancy. I didn't speak about it for many years. And it was only until I could reach a level of self-acceptance and find community that I was able to start finding my voice. And I thank DDoc for also that opportunity to be able to share my lived experience. So looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks so much for being here, Helga. And talk about another person who's been awake since all hour. I was on a session this morning with Jazz. It was a respectable 9 a.m. for me. It was a totally unrespectable 3:30 a.m. for you, Jazz. How are you still standing? Hello.
Hi, namaste. Thank you, Renza, and good afternoon, good evening to all of you. My name is Jazz Sethi. I'm from India. And I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 13 years old. So I've been living with it for 15 years now. And I run an organization, a not-for-profit organization in India called the Diabestes Foundation. And I think a lot of the work we do is trying to echo what everyone around the world is doing, talking and trying to find solutions for the very pervasive societal stigma that exists in low-income countries such as mine. So I'm very excited to be here.
Well, let's stay with you, Jazz. Tell me, what does diabetes stigma look like in India? And I will say, I know India is a very large country. There are a lot of people with type 1 and type 2 and all sorts of diabetes, so it will be different. But can you give us a snapshot of what stigma looks like in India, please?
Absolutely. So I think with India, I always say we're a land of extremes. So we just sent a rocket to the moon. We've got some of the best minds, the best education in India. But we also have an India that is 60% rooted in the villages. And what diabetes stigma looks like in India, it actually is like a shadow that looms above. And the shadow is of what we call, what will people think? What will people around me say? And that societal validation and approval is so deep rooted in our culture that anything that is apart from the norm is considered wrong. So a child battling with fluctuating sugars is not seen as resilience. It is seen as a flaw. And because that pressure to be perfect is so valid and it's so deep rooted, the stories of stigma are disturbing realities, you know, from being denied care to being isolated to being asked little children to kill themselves. It's very extreme on one end, whereas on the other end, it is just those looks and the smirks and the comments. But I come from a land where both these extremes are very real, and it's stigma in India is a very tangible outcome. It is where it can actually, stigma can lead to fatal outcomes, just as lack of insulin can.
Yeah, thanks, Jazz. Thanks for that. And Anita, let me ask you, Talk to me about what stigma looks like. And because so much of your work is working with women with diabetes, can we focus on women perhaps and what stigma, in the case of women in Indonesia, might be experiencing?
Yeah, since I'm working with the women in diabetes community, and I experienced the stigma by myself. So as a community, we try as hard as we can to protect the community. Like 1 or 2 months ago, there's a member who experienced miscarriage, and her doctor blamed her because he experienced hypoglycemia, and that's caused he lost her baby. And he shot herself. And what we can do is to try to protect her from all the stigma coming from the society blaming her. And it's really hard. Why? Because a mother lost her child and she shouldn't be blamed at. And so that's why we made a project. We have this women project. We went to island to educate about women with diabetes.
Yeah.
Because I know education is the key, so we try to provide the knowledge to the society that women with diabetes is really special, and please don't add our burden with stigma.
Yeah. Thanks, Anita. Chelsea, what's stigma in the workplace? Have you got experiences of your own that you would like to share, or perhaps some that you've heard? What does that look like in the US, in Florida? Is it different in Florida to if you're somewhere else? Let's talk about your own experiences.
It's diabetes stigma in the United States is deeply rooted in a couple of things, one being history, the other being culture. There's a misconception, I think, around the world that just because the United States is such a superpower and this, that, and the other, that everyone who has access to healthcare, insurance, diabetes, medications and devices is not the case. There's a big divide in lower income communities, in Black and brown communities, having access to information as well as the treatments. So, and that spills over into the workplace, because when you're dealing with something that's so deeply rooted in culture and history, it just carries on it obviously is going to carry into the workplace, by which I've met people in my workplace who've lived with diabetes for over 40 years, and she confessed to me that she has yet to speak about her diabetes her whole employment career. She's never talked about it. And what this does is it makes people afraid to bring it up, because they're afraid of being judged, of being passed over for promotions, of being thought to think they can't handle the type of job that they have because of what they think their team leader is going to think. And here's the breakdown of it. If you've got a team leader or a supervisor that doesn't understand the severity of living with a condition like diabetes, it doesn't matter if your team leader's boss may understand it. The team leader is going to be a conduit between that. So if he's lost understanding and doesn't give you that compassion, or to give you the ability to take care of yourself, it's going to trickle down, and the whole thing just falls apart. And then that person that doesn't take care of themselves is going to pass it on to someone else. Well, they know that person has diabetes. Well, I'm not going to talk about mine. So you have all these resources there in the workplace, but you don't take advantage of them because you think it's going to hinder you from being able to keep your job and being able to put food on the table, to take care of your children, to take care of your parents, or whatever it is responsibilities that you have.
Yeah.
And so much of that is deep rooted in the history and in the culture.
Yeah. Thanks, Chelsea. Helga, you shared a remarkable story when we were in Hamburg at EASD on the podium there, so I hope that you don't mind that I'm asking you again to share it. But let's talk about when you were diagnosed with diabetes. How did you share that with people? What did that look like?
Whoa. Well, the quick answer is I didn't. I just blanked out. The immediate thing was, you're sitting there and you get in the stand because we called him Baby Bumper, and Bumper is growing at a phenomenal rate in his 3rd trimester, and you get told, You know, I think we've got diabetes happening here, casually. You know, it's announced casually, and I think what the duality I sat was, you know, the imaging, the storytelling, the celebration, the aunties, my mom, my cousins, my friends, all telling me about this joyous birth and how healthy and awesome it's going to be, and then I get told diabetes. And so all I could think about was shame. I've let myself down. I've let my unborn baby down. I've put everything at risk. And the shame really sat in me poring over all these magazines, listening to all the conversations, and I was everything but that because I had diabetes, and this was self-inflicted. This was my fault. And so I just decided to keep quiet about it. It was only my son's dad, it was only my physicians, the dietitian, the endocrinologist that initially knew that I had diabetes. And so I went through the pregnancy showing up as if I was the perfect picture of maternal bliss. And inside, what was happening for me was, after doctor's visit, pulling into the driveway in tears, because I really didn't feel whether that was, they say perception's reality. And my perception at the time is, you know what? You have to walk this road on your own because this is your fault. You know, there isn't, I don't have, what's the word, agency to seek support or to have that support, or it didn't feel like it was front and center and readily available.
Yeah.
And so that was the start of the journey.
Thanks, Helga.
Around diabetes.
Thank you. Jazz, stigma is so heavy. I feel the weight of these stories now, but let's talk about what you're doing and some of the initiatives that are happening with Diabesties and with your own incredible advocacy efforts. How are we making this change? How are we getting to lighten the load of stigma?
You know, I think one of the key things that we need to understand as a community is that an individual's essence isn't determined by their health. There's so much more that they are, their personality, their drive, their resilience, that actually determines who they are as a person. But we often see it so compartmentalized. And all of us, I think everyone in the room, anyone who's had diabetes has faced some kind of stigma. The problem is that the varying extreme is determined by so many other social determinants of health, you know, your income, the number of family members that live with you, where you come from, whether you're from a village or from a city, whether you're a girl or a boy, you know, what religion you fall under. So many other things impact the severity of stigma. One thing is so unfortunate that everyone will experience stigma in some form or the other. So I think the idea that I keep talking about is that we need to talk more about calling it out. I think that we need to refuse to accept stigma in any manifestation, any insensitive poster, any comment, any smirk. It has to be confronted with a confident response. And we need to do more as a healthcare fraternity to talk about stigma at diagnosis. So the utopian idea is that no stigma will exist. If I have to pull back and be a little bit more realistic, especially in a country like India, I want to warn people at diagnosis that you are going to hear these things. Do not get swayed by that. Here's enough resources to tell you how to stand your ground. I never had that growing up. Many people don't have that growing up. And I think that's the essence. Prepare them for an inevitable, and hopefully that inevitable becomes a much more comforting society soon.
Amazing, thank you. Anita, we're really getting short on time, so super quick answers here, but I do want to ask you, Anita, what's the change we want to see? What is it that you want to see? You've got one sentence to wrap that up. What is the change that you want to see in the community?
Let's empower ourselves.
Yep.
That's it. Yeah, okay. Don't let people make you down. Let's empower ourselves. You're strong.
Yep. Chelsea, what about for you? What is the change that we want to see?
You've always been a fan of the things that I've said online that you think like my quotes. Yep. I actually heard something, oddly enough, in a documentary about Milli Vanilli of all things. And this is a saying that I found out has been around for quite some time, but it struck me as really deep. But then I applied it to diabetes stigma. And that saying goes, a lie will take the elevator while the truth will take the stairs. So this is the thing that we've been dealing with stigma is the lies will get accepted faster than the truth will. And even when the truth shows up, it has to go through a bouncer to be accepted. You know, it's not going to be readily accepted. It has to be proven. Yeah. You know, it's like the truth has to show its ID first before it can actually reach the ears of the people. So echoing off of what Jazz said, much like we started the conversation about the price of insulin and how we move that needle, we need to move the needle the same way by talking about stigma, making it part of the conversation more to where it stays in people's ears and stays on their lips, to where it just organically starts to become part of the conversation and then starts to become a movement.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you, Chelsea. And Helga, I'm going to give you the last word, but you've got a sentence. Otherwise, the playoff music's going to start.
Okay, I'll do this very quickly. We haven't arrived until our voices are heard. We need to start normalizing the conversations we are having.
Thank you so much. Anita, Chelsea, Helga, and Jazz, thank you so, so much. Jazz, go and get some sleep. Chelsea, go back to bed. Anita and Helga, your days are starting. Go and do World Diabetes Day things. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, a bit ironic, somebody in Florida telling us about the lies taking the elevator and the truth taking the stairs. In no state in the union is that probably truer. Great discussion there. Let's look at, we're going to look at the media and a little video to trigger the conversation.
Norman, a number of years ago...
I didn't like the way you said that.
No, you shouldn't. A number of years ago, on World Diabetes Day, I was interviewed by a journalist about something, probably one of those scary campaigns, actually. And then I was asked, just let's make sure we get your name right. And Renza Scibilia is not a name to get right. And they said, is there anything else? I said, yeah, look, if you could, I prefer person with diabetes, and I don't like victim, I don't like sufferer. So just Renza Scibilia, person with diabetes, would be great. The next day I opened the paper. Actually, I didn't actually open the front of the paper because it was on the front page of The Age. Renza Scibilia, diabetic victim. Why are your people like this?
We love the negative. Look, it's shameful. What can you say? But we are tuned to the negative. We know that we get a rise out of people with a bad news story than a good news story, or finding the negative. It's part of human psychology. That we've survived because we respond more strongly emotionally to the negative. That's why they do it.
Okay.
It's not an excuse.
We have examples of how to change the narrative. Because diabetes has an image problem, we have got to reframe it. We've got examples of that. Let's talk about perhaps the way that suicide is reported.
Yeah, I think that's one of the models.
Yep.
Where they have changed the media dialogue. I think it's very, very different now from maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So 10 or 15 years ago, the media probably killed people because you had contagion. So you had one child going to a bridge and jumping off, then you had other kids. So you described the means, or you had a kid finding a gun or a knife. And so describing the means was a no-no because you created contagion. And then there was the sense of victimhood, speaking of victimhood, which is that it used to be a crime, believe it or not, to take your own life. You were committing self-murder. So you committed suicide. So the education has been that nobody commits suicide, people take their own lives. And so that has changed a lot. You'll still see exceptions to that, but it's been hammered away at the media, hammered away at media bosses, and you've seen the language change.
So how do we do it with diabetes? You know, we've had over 10 years of a new language for diabetes. You know, we're really clear about the words that empower, that make people feel stronger rather than that we're being pushed down. How do we actually make some change in the media? What is it? Next time I'm being interviewed, what should I do? Stand over someone while they're writing? What
well, I mean, you have limit. So, I mean, what I've done on the health report for many, many decades now is one of the first things you instituted is that we don't talk about patients on any condition. We don't talk about schizophrenics, diabetics, asthmatics. It's always people with, and I've been doing that for years. It hasn't really spread. So you still see all those problems there. So, and I'm not making an excuse for the media, but when disease-oriented organizations run scare campaigns to generate interest, to generate change, you're perpetuating that stigma. And so a journalist says, well, you know, Foundation X did that. I'm sorry, what's wrong? So we're scaring people about diabetic foot disease. So why are we running a campaign on diabetic foot disease that's doing that, rather than a campaign which is actually about helping people live with diabetes? So in many ways, the campaigns are falling into that trap, which is of the negative. Now, they may well work. Now, public health campaigns traditionally work by fear and disgust. So, for example, to stop kids smoking, there was one campaign where they did research and they found that what do kids hate? They hate cockroaches and toilets. So they had a kid with a cigarette, they were going into a toilet bowl, picking out a cigarette and smoking it. That had a huge impact on kids. So you've got these, look, the point I'm making here is, it's about getting people in a room, not sending them letters or pamphlets, and getting them in the room, getting the media in a room, and saying, this is unacceptable, this is not what this is about, you're harming people with this, we're changing, you should be changing too. And that happened with suicide. They probably think suicide's more acute because it happens like that, but this kills people too, diabetes stigma, and that's got to be communicated.
Yeah, and I think that we saw some pretty scary examples up there of some campaigns from years past and not so past, I guess, as well. They don't work. We've been trying to scare people to look after themselves, to do all the things that we're meant to do, and we're not moving the needle on where diabetes is sitting or how people are thinking about diabetes. We're probably actually contributing to stigma by showing those scary campaigns. So that's what's giving the media license to do that.
Well,
right.
well, not entirely, but you're also normalizing stuff. So, for example, with obesity and overweight, entirely the wrong message for the community. So what do you hear about diabetes and obesity and overweight? Which is, you know, oh, woe is us, 60% of Australians are either overweight or obese. The world is going to come to an end. Well, that perpetuates stigma too.
Of course.
But if you're overweight and obese, you think, oh, that's all right, I'm part of the majority. Rather than saying, isn't it great, Australia's a great place, 40% of people are not overweight or obese. And this is how they've got to that point in a more positive approach. You've got to flip that. And so that if your norm about diabetes is that this is terrible, your foot's going to drop off, and you're going to get kidney failure, and all these things are inevitable, then it becomes the norm.
We're going to unpack this a little bit more.
We are.
Because we've got some organisations coming and joining us now to have that discussion. But I think that this is a really important discussion to have. You know, we're talking about stigma in the community, but sometimes we have to hold a mirror up, I think, as well to those of us working in diabetes, if you like, to see how we're contributing to this too.
But first, a short video.
Yeah.
Hello everyone. Whilst many of us strive for a world without diabetes full stop, a world without the stigma or discrimination associated with diabetes is not only much easier to achieve, but should be mandatory. Diabetes stigma comes in many forms, from making assumptions about why someone has diabetes, to critiquing food choices, or commenting loudly on a person with diabetes. So let's remember this World Diabetes Day to look beyond these stereotypes. Let's bring empathy and inclusion rather than stigma and discrimination to the lives of those people living with diabetes, their families and loved ones.
Hi there, my name's John Wentworth. I'm a diabetes researcher and I'm involved in a number of national research programs. I'm growing pretty tired of hearing the pervasive view that diabetes is a lifestyle disease that people bring upon themselves. This is simply not true. I fully support this campaign and I'm strongly encouraging my colleagues to come along for the ride.
We're from the Australian Centre for Accelerating Diabetes Innovations, ACADI, and we've taken the pledge to end diabetes stigma.
In a world without diabetes stigma, all people living with diabetes could freely participate in research, leading to breakthroughs in diabetes care, helping individuals live healthier lives with dignity.
My name is Dr. Felissa DeRose, and I am one person of many that has taken the pledge to end diabetes stigma. I did it happily and without hesitation, and I hope you join me and others by signing the pledge.
Hi, I'm Jane from the United States, and as a person living with diabetes for 48 years, I have personally dealt with stigma, and I've also worked with many people who have diabetes and have experienced stigma through my practice as a diabetes care and education specialist. A world without diabetes stigma means that people with diabetes can focus on living life, and we can fit diabetes into the life that we want to live.
Diabetes stigma is a real challenge for a lot of people in our community, and I think it's important to know that it's not necessarily that people are, deliberately trying to make you feel bad about yourself or about your condition. It can often be quite subconscious, I guess, and I think for me personally, sometimes there's always that fear of blame, or there's that fear that people actually feel like it's your fault that you might not only have the condition, but that you're not managing it absolutely perfectly. And I think that can have a really serious impact on people's mental health, and that obviously aligns to their physical health as well. So I think the more that we can get greater understanding and greater empathy of diabetes and broader, medical conditions, particularly chronic illnesses, it's really important just to bring that underlying empathy back into conversations.
I'm Justine Kane, the Group CEO of Diabetes Australia. Helping people with diabetes to live long and live well is at the heart of absolutely everything we do. That is why we are so committed to supporting the global movement to end diabetes stigma. More than 1.1 million Australians report being blamed or shamed for living with diabetes, and more than 360,000 of these people say that it impacts their ability to live well. We want a future where diabetes can do no harm, and the global movement to end diabetes stigma is an important step to doing just that.
Thank you to all those people. And we're going to continue that discussion with leaders of diabetes organisations in Australia. Let's welcome Gordon Bunyan, who is Board Director of Diabetes Australia and the Diabetes Australia Research Trust, Vice President of the International Diabetes Federation for 8 years in the earlier part of the 2000s, and the first non-medical chair of IDF Western Pacific. Glenn Noonan, who's current CEO and former President of Diabetes Victoria, father of a son with type 1 diabetes. Professor Tony Russell, who's President of the Australian Diabetes Society, Director of Diabetes and Endocrinology at the Alfred, and Professor of Medicine at Monash University. And let's re-welcome the leaders of the International Consensus, Renza, Professor Jane Spate, Foundation Director of the Australian Centre for Behavioural Research in Diabetes, and Matthew Garza, who's Destigmatized Program Manager at the Diatribe Foundation in the United States. So words are cheap, actions are expensive and meaningful. What are we going to do with this? How are things going to change? What are the priorities? Well, let's just start with doctors and nurses, Tony. I mean, we've not heard good stuff in the comments so far that doctors themselves, I don't know about nurses, but doctors themselves aren't very good at this, at understanding the impact of the words they use. And probably they believe them.
It's true. It's a real problem in the profession, and we've heard today already that it's interesting that it was the endocrinologist that did give the license, which was good. But
look, you're a professor of endocrinology. This is not a career-ending question, you know.
That's right. But I think within our profession, there's lack of knowledge about diabetes in general. And we're struggling because it's conceived that, oh, it's a bit of sugar sometimes, but on the other hand, it's blamed for everything. And people aren't taken seriously and looked into other causes for their conditions. We've also got the problem, particularly in hospitals, we take over the care and don't allow patients or people with diabetes to manage themselves. And they have the best knowledge. And that's my approach when I'm dealing with people with diabetes in my clinics, that I'm learning from them. And they're living with this condition every day. And we need to have that empathy, and we need to change the agenda in terms of, and we need to demonstrate that particularly with our junior doctors coming through, leading by example. And I was mentioning this before to Jane, that we have an agenda. It's often just looking at numbers and HbA1c and control and medication, when really we should just put that aside and say, how are you going? What problems are you having? And rather than just the numbers. And we need to convey that and to the rest of the profession. And there's ways, I think, to do that, which we could sort of mention.
Glenn, do you think there's too much conflation of type 1 and type 2 in the community's minds here, and that's part of the problem?
Too much confusion?
Conflation. Really, they think it's the same issue, and we've heard, you know, and we really pushed hard on lifestyle, overweight, obesity, and as we heard there, I mean, both are actually genetic problems, just different kinds of genetic problems.
Yeah, look, I think clearly there's a lack of knowledge in the community. There's a lack of education, irrespective of the type of diabetes, that exists. That exists right across the community. It exists. Tony's talking about the profession, but the lack of knowledge is in the workforce as well. So not the medical workforce, but the workforce at large. It's in the education system. It's everywhere, and that's a really, really important part of where we need to be focused on. We need to be talking about the impact of diabetes. We need to be increasing the understanding.
So how do you? Let's just focus on type 2 for a moment. How do you focus a prevention message that's going to work when you're talking to your creative advertising agency and you're saying, well, here's your brief. We've got to get effective prevention. We've got to get behavior change as a result of this advertising campaign, but we're not going to increase stigma. And they say, what?
Yeah, so that's the challenge. I think, you know, and we talked about it before, your messages,
Well, I want you to play out the brief. Play me the brief for the advertising agency that makes this work, that you get a prevention message for type 2 which doesn't increase stigma.
Yeah, well, it's got to include a few aspects. One, education. Two, it needs to be positive. It needs to be empathetic. It needs to be authentic. I mean, that's how, as humans, we always should be. And in terms of an advertising brief and how we want to connect with people in a genuine way, you know, those principles I think hold true.
Jane?
You want me to let him off the hook?
I want you to give us the advertising brief, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'm a behavioural scientist or a psychologist. I don't think we actually yet know enough about how to run these campaigns that would be effective in supporting individuals to prevent any type of diabetes, to support the community. I just don't think that we've ever put the investment into the research that helps us to understand what the right messaging is to engage people in understanding all of these issues without throwing people with existing diabetes under the bus as we do it. And I think that's a big problem. We do need investment in that type of research. We also need that research to be co-designed with community, because when we talk with people with diabetes about these campaigns, we know that a proportion of people find them stigmatizing. We've done the first research into that at the moment, and we're trying to get the paper published. We tried last year to get this paper published. It's been taking us a whole year to get there. And we just don't have funding for this kind of research in the first place either. So there's big problems here because diabetes organizations don't have enough money for these kinds of campaigns. They put their money into the advertising, they put it into the TV and the media. They don't put it into the research that actually needs to go into to develop an effective campaign in the first place. I think we need all diabetes organizations coming together on this big problematic issue, because it's feeding a narrative that's telling the world that people with diabetes bring it on themselves and that they're to blame for their condition.
Can I add to that and say I don't actually think we should be running prevention campaigns, because it's too much then about that personal responsibility. Until we have got communities that are set up for people to make the healthier choice, that, you know, that is the easier choice for people to make, that we don't have junk food advertising thrown at kids and at adults, that it is as affordable and as easy to find fresh foods and vegetables as it is to buy the less healthy option, then expecting people to make the healthier choices and be healthier is unrealistic. And all we are doing is continuing to perpetuate this idea that you could have prevented it, you didn't, it's on yourself. When in actual fact, people are living in food deserts. There is nowhere for them to be physically active. There is nowhere for them to do all the right things, and yet that's all we're focusing on. You want to run a campaign, you run it at people who are legislating and funding and policymakers, and get them to change the situation so that people can be healthier, because that's the easy way to do it.
So focus the money on system change.
Yep, absolutely.
Rather than individuals. Gordon, we were talking earlier about the sort of barriers that can happen at work in the legal system and legal barriers. What's your perspective on that? What needs to change there?
Well, let me tell you a small story about another lawyer, and that's Sir Garfield Barwick, who's long dead. But in the
Chief Justice of Australia,
former Chief Justice, former Attorney General, Federal Attorney General,
helped to sack Gough Whitlam.
He did, apparently, yes.
Just so you've got him in context.
Wow.
But he lived his whole life with type 1 diabetes and never told anybody about it because he was so concerned about the effect on his life. Now, when I came into the profession, I was diagnosed at 18. 47 3/4 years ago, I was much more willing to talk about it. And I think that's one of the key things to take from what Renza was saying, that the more we talk about it, and this pledge really is a stimulus to have the organisations and people feel free to talk about it more often, it's an important development. The legislation is there to protect against discrimination. The law is one thing, the practice of it in the workplace and others is another, and that's where the organisations really need to be doing more to support people in the workplace, to make them aware of what their rights are and how they can act to protect themselves and make their employees, their employers and their workplace generally more conscious of what diabetes actually is, rather than living the myth or the dream.
Matthew, if you live in Australia and you look at the United States, we think, oh God, we take pity on you. We used to admire it and want to be Americans, and now we start kind of saying, oh God, why don't you all just come over here and have a nice time? But look, it is a difficult environment with healthcare, with people taking ideological positions. It tends to be a bit more extreme than here. What's just give us a flavor, because this is a global discussion we're having, not just an Australian one. Give us a flavor of the challenges of implementing the pledge, not just getting people to sign it, but to mean it and to change behavior.
Yeah, of course. So this is where I get to make a really funny joke about the ridiculous things that American politicians say. But a few years ago, I think it was like in 2017, the US budget director, Mick Mulvaney, made some comments that were, and forgive me if I misquote, but something along the lines of, well, we have plenty of money, but we're not going to spend it on people that sit at home, eat poorly, and get diabetes. And it's comments and phrases and positions like that that then go on to influence the decisions that policymakers and researchers, healthcare professionals, and all of us make on what conditions get funded, what conditions get researched, and what conditions we try to find solutions for. And so we have to start influencing those people in power to change the way that they're thinking about this condition, because they're the ones that hold the purse strings, and they're the ones that can make a real difference. And so I think that's, it's not something that's unique to the US, but it is something that makes a real difference if that's the ideology that people have that are then controlling, who ends up actually getting funding for research. That's going to have a pretty big impact.
Now, you come from San Francisco, which is the city that really spawned probably the most aggressive and effective consumer action we've ever known. And that's ACT UP and the response to HIV. Before we even knew what AIDS was, are there lessons for us from HIV?
Absolutely. And I would say not just HIV as well. So I work at the Diatribe Foundation. We're a diabetes nonprofit and advocacy group that we do a lot of education, we do advocacy work, and I'm grateful to be able to work on our Stigma programs. But they're relatively new in the grand scheme of what Diatribe has been working on. But when we started to kind of dip our toe in the water of how can we really make a difference when it comes to diabetes stigma, the first place we looked was to these other conditions and marginalized identities that had actually made some really big strides in eliminating stigma and discrimination in their groups. So HIV and AIDS is one of them. When you think about the stigmatizing comments and the not even wanting to touch somebody who has HIV, they used to happen back in the 80s and 90s to where we are today. It's pretty incredible. And in some other kind of groups, you can see examples of that too. So for example, with LGBTQ advocacy, one of the big things that they worked on was visibility. So the idea that coming out and the idea that the way that media portrays that community is having an impact, that's absolutely something that we can and should be adopting when it comes to diabetes stigma. People should be proud to say that they have diabetes and that they are part of a community of such incredibly strong individuals. And the media plays a role in making sure that we have accurate, respectful, and positive portrayals of diabetes. You see that same strategy being used in the mental health space, the idea that we can and should be talking about the challenges that we have when it comes to mental health. And in that space as well, there was a huge push on language and on the phrases and the words that we're using. And we've seen that be co-opted by people who work in substance use and in addiction. So we are all kind of, I think, circling around these strategies that we know work.
But the examples you've just given are of very assertive groups of people who are living with the condition or the disease or the problem, and they don't take any shit. Yeah. And when something goes wrong in the media, they're onto it. Yeah. And so it becomes, I remember once having lunch somewhere at the University of Melbourne here, and with David Pennington, who chaired the AIDS group for government, AIDS advisory group, and the Australian newspaper, part of News Limited, had a story about mosquitoes spreading AIDS. And he had a call into the editor of the Australian, which you could hear the conversation from the end of the lunchroom, and it's probably the last, very shortly after that, they hired a doctor to report on medicine. And so it's very assertive. So do you think we're a bit too shy in retiring in diabetes? Too polite?
I think that at this point, we don't know just how powerful the voices of the diabetes community can be. I think that we've seen how strong some of, especially the type 1 activists have been when it comes to being vocal about diabetes stigma, about having diabetes and what that looks like. But the type 1 community is relatively small when we think about the global diabetes community and all those with type 2, with gestational, with MODY, and all of the other different types of diabetes as well. We need to be raising those collective voices to show just how powerful we are, how much strength we have, and to also be able to, put our foot down and say, like, this is it, this is enough, we have to stop this.
So what can happen in the community?
Well, the community, I think, the community is incredibly powerful. We see wins all the time where the community has led the charge. You know, in Australia, we saw it earlier this year with when, a type of insulin was being threatened to be removed from the market. There was a lot of noise, there was a lot of banging of drums, and the decision was made to keep it on the market. We've seen it with subsidies for continuous glucose monitoring. The community does have power. But I do think that this takes a larger, it's going to take a larger effort. I can tell you that if there ever is a really stigmatising comment made anywhere, I remember Jamie Oliver stood in front of a giant Coke bottle with the word diabetes on it, and he apologised within 24 hours because the community was so angry about it. We've seen that time and time again, but I think we do need it to be beyond just us. We need allies in the community. So you bet people with diabetes will jump up and down, but we do need, if the Australian runs a story like that, we would want Glenn to get on the phone or if it was Herald Sun, to get on the phone and be screaming at the editor saying, stop this and stop it now. We need it to be coming from all corners. Because it's too easy to dismiss it as the people with diabetes being precious flowers who need to just toughen up and get over it, because we don't really mean anything. But I think it is going to take more than just community outrage. It needs to come from everywhere, and everyone to have an absolute no tolerance policy with it. It's the pledge. It says to call it out. We need people to call it out.
So what happens next, and what's the top priority for action? In your area, Tony?
Well, we've got the parliamentary inquiry at the moment into diabetes, and I think advocacy is going to be a big part of this. And then from the profession point of view, as a diabetes society, I think it comes into education, supporting research for our colleagues, both doctors and researchers. Glenn?
I'd say advocacy and education would be right up there. We're doing a lot around that in terms of advocacy, both at an individual level and a system level in terms of change. I think we're seeing positive things there. We've done a lot of really successful work with the education system here in Victoria. I think a big call out when we raised concerns with the education department, and what we were seeing was kids literally being told to leave the school, right, because they had diabetes. We jumped right on that, and we worked with the education department, and they've been fantastic. So that's the sort of thing about where we can work with the system. And similarly, education is paramount as well.
Gordon?
Well, and I'd add, I agree with Glenn completely, but the other area is research, and it's research in a number of areas, and that requires funding. So the diabetes community not only has to talk about what needs to happen from a stigma point of view, it needs to then translate that into encouraging themselves and others to give And the more we talk about stigma, I think the more likely we are to have some of the captains of industry who maybe have type 2 diabetes but are too frightened to say anything about it, coming out and realising that research is the answer in so many respects.
Just to add back onto the research, one of the things we did, we actually set up the Australian Centre for Behavioural Research in Diabetes, Diabetes Victoria and our partner Deakin University. So research dollars are hard. They're even harder to get for this. They're even harder to get behavioural research. And so we had the foresight a number of years ago to say, well, we're going to set up a centre dedicated to behavioural research. And that's where the ACBRD came from. That's what it is. Two partners that have committed the funding, now for 13 years, such that the centre exists. Now that I think is a first, and that's actually, that's why Jane's here, right, in terms of that funding. So I think we need to take a few risks, if you like. We need to show some innovation in the types of research that we set up, the manner in which we do it, in terms of, this was a different organisation that we set up. It was a different way to do it as well. So examples like that in terms of we need the dollars, but we need to think how are we going to use them.
The ideas.
We need to do it in different ways.
Jane, next steps, where to from here, high priority?
Yeah, we've got to change that narrative. We've got to stop that fear-based messaging. It's part of the pledge that we need to challenge fear-based messaging and imagery when we see it. We need to call it out, and we need to avoid using it ourselves. And I stand by that pledge, and I will call anyone out that's using it if I see it on social media, and I have done recently, because I've got integrity. And I'm calling on everyone to have integrity about this, and call on your colleagues. If it's your colleague doing it, you can educate them gently about why that's not appropriate, why the language they're using, why the comments they're making are just not okay anymore. We can do this gently, or we can do it tough. It's anyone's choice.
Matthew?
Yeah, I think one of the important things to remember is that by eliminating diabetes stigma and discrimination, it's going to go a long way to helping us eliminate all health stigma. And I think that that's such an important part, is that, just like Renza said, it has to go beyond the diabetes community. We need those allies as well. There's so many allies out there, and collectively, all of us have something that we can be advocating for and fighting for. And I just want to also encourage all of the leaders of the incredible diabetes organizations here, and health organizations and every organization, that eliminating this type of stigma needs to be integrated into your strategic plans, into your 5 and 10 and 20-year plans. That's the way that we're going to really start getting, I think, the attention and the money and the awareness around why this is so important. If we say collectively, this is a priority.
How could I not give you the last word?
The way it should be. All of these are great ideas, but you've got to have people in the room, people with diabetes in the room, because I promise you that so much of the stigmatising messaging that goes out there would have been called out if there were people in the room who were helping to shape that messaging. So, Tony, awesome that there is a parliamentary committee happening, and that's great. But are there people with diabetes actually in the room having conversations as whatever is being developed is being developed? And I think that that's one of the things that's really, really critical, is that unless people with diabetes are sitting there and are part of the decision-making process and are pointing out exactly how, whatever it is that's being decided, the potential to stigmatise the community and how to reword it and reframe it in a way that it's not going to do that, we're just going to keep perpetuating these same myths over and over and over again.
Could you please join me in thanking our amazing panel? So, as you've heard many times, well over 2,000 individuals and more than 250 organisations across more than 100 countries have taken the pledge to date. You can take the pledge by visiting enddiabetesstigma.org. The recording of this event will be available within a week via the same website.
Thanks so much to the Australian Centre for Behavioural Research in Diabetes, Diabetes Victoria and Deakin University, DDoC and the Diatribe Foundation, including all the people behind the scenes who made the videos. Oh my goodness, those videos, Joe, amazing, amazing. Built websites, Victoria, did all of the promotional activities. Thank you so much for making tonight happen.
And thanks to all our panellists here in Melbourne and around the world, as well as to those who shared videos or photos shown here today.
And thanks to thanks to our audiences here in Melbourne and all around the world. You are our allies by being here and listening to us. Thank you for joining us for this really important occasion.
And thank you to the 51 members of the expert panel who brought the international consensus together, and to Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology for publishing it. You can check out the paper. It's available now and free to access. It is free to access? Yes, good.
Yes, it is. Look, most importantly, thanks to everyone who is taking the pledge. Thank you for committing to proactively contributing to bringing an end to diabetes stigma, to create a more compassionate, respectful world for people with diabetes. We need to exist in this world. Diabetes is unfortunately is along for the journey, unfortunately, but let's do everything we can to minimise the harm that stigma causes and to try and make our lives just a little bit easier. That's what we ask for. Happy World Diabetes Day, everyone, and thank you so much.